Yeah. So August 1st is going to come. We haven't really had a lot of luck with Canada. We have the confines of a deal with China, but we haven't really, we don't have a deal with Canada.
It's the middle of summer, but the temperature between the United States and Canada has never been colder. Just days ago, President Trump signaled something few expected to hear: the US may no longer be interested in reaching a new trade agreement with Canada. Instead, he hinted that tariffs alone might do the job. The message was simple: Washington is done waiting. As he boarded Air Force One for a trip to Scotland, Trump's decision marked a turning point. With the self-imposed August 1st deadline fast approaching, the United States is preparing to hit Canadian goods with a 35% tariff unless a new deal is signed. But on the other side of the border, Canada isn't blinking. Prime Minister Mark Carney and his team made their stance clear: Canada will not sign a bad deal, no matter the pressure. At the heart of the current standoff is a paradox. The Canada-US-Mexico Agreement, or CUSMA, is still in force. Under this agreement, over 90% of Canadian exports to the US face zero tariffs, assuming they comply with rules of origin. But the reality on the ground is shifting. Section 232 tariffs on steel, aluminum, copper, and auto parts remain in place, with some rates as high as 50%. And now, with the threat of an across-the-board 35% tariff, Canada faces a second layer of economic pressure that exists outside the CUSMA framework. These measures have had a chilling effect on Canadian industries and raised questions about whether the US is still honoring the spirit of its trade commitments. I think the president, is trying to up a little pressure on Canada. We saw this in the case of Japan as well. So I think he's still posturing a little bit, trying to create an environment where Canada might be willing to give up a little bit more. This isn't the first time Trump has used tariffs as leverage. But this time, Canada isn't giving in. The Prime Minister's position is supported by provincial premiers and trade officials. Their consensus: a rushed deal made to avoid a tariff deadline is more dangerous than no deal at all. Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc echoed this view after high-level meetings in Washington, emphasizing that any agreement must deliver long-term stability for Canadian workers. Meanwhile, Carney continues to resist short-term pressure tactics, arguing that Canada needs structural guarantees, not just temporary relief. So, Canadian companies that sell things to the United States, almost 30% of them are now redirecting to other countries. So, they're starting to diversify who they trade with. The political battle is spilling over into the economy. According to a July 2025 report by the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, nearly 30% of Canadian exporters have already begun shifting trade away from the US, and 37% of companies say they're now sourcing components and inputs from non-US suppliers. This isn't just a short-term pivot. For many firms, it reflects a deeper shift in trust. After decades of economic integration, Canadian businesses are hedging their bets, diversifying markets, reducing reliance on American buyers, and building more resilient supply chains. And that may eventually cost the US, too. Because when Canada rewires its trade model, America loses not just a customer, but a partner. So why isn't Canada racing to sign something before August 1st? The answer lies beyond the headlines. In 2026, CUSMA faces a mandatory joint review, an opportunity to revise, restructure, or even renegotiate the entire agreement. For Carney, that review is the real battleground. And to enter it from a position of strength, Canada cannot afford to settle now. Sources close to Ottawa suggest the government is preparing a broader economic security framework for future negotiations, one that ties defense cooperation, Arctic sovereignty, and clean energy into the trade equation. In that context, a quick fix with Trump could weaken Canada's position in a much larger game. The August 1st deadline is looming, but no agreement is in sight. The United States is preparing to raise tariffs. Canada is preparing to absorb the blow. What we're witnessing isn't just a tough phase in a long relationship. It may be the beginning of a fundamental shift. Trump is demanding results now. Carney is planning for what comes next. And in the space between those two strategies, that's where the future of North American trade is being rewritten. Now, the Prime Minister has already stated that Canada won't accept a, quote, bad deal, even though concessions and border measures taken so far up, and Canadian counter-tariffs, are still on the table. but I would look to see something Arctic specific in the budget. We might want to look at some of our major projects being done in the Arctic. While the world watches Washington's flurry of trade deals, something quieter, but potentially more lasting, is happening in Canada. As Trump courts new partners in Asia, Canada is turning to the Arctic, building economic resilience and forging powerful alliances with indigenous communities. It's not just a policy shift, it's a strategic reset. Let's take a closer look at how Trump sidelined Canada and how Canada is pushing back. Since returning to office, President Trump has pursued a transactional approach to global trade. In July alone, his administration has announced new deals or frameworks with Japan, the Philippines, Indonesia, and the United Kingdom. These agreements are fast, headline-friendly, and focused on slashing tariffs, sometimes down to 10 or 15%. But Canada isn't part of that club. Despite being America's largest export market and closest neighbor, Canada has been left out. Trump's logic: Canada already has a deal, CUSMA, formerly known as USMCA. According to US officials, that agreement includes carve-outs, so Canada shouldn't expect further concessions. In fact, the opposite is happening. On March 4, Trump imposed 25% tariffs on most Canadian goods. And by June, steel and aluminum tariffs were raised to 50%. Now, he's threatening a sweeping 35% tariff by August 1 unless Canada agrees to more US market access. Washington calls it a reciprocal tariff, but to many in Ottawa, it feels like targeted punishment. And what a great place. It has economic development potential, but there's defense, importance, strategic defense, Arctic bases, other dual use, potential, projects to roll out. And it sounds like willing partners potentially all around. While Canada has responded with counter-tariffs, reindustrialization, and a quiet consumer boycott of American goods, its most strategic move may be the one few are talking about. Canada is opening a new front, the Arctic. Under Prime Minister Mark Carney, Canada has launched a sweeping northern strategy centered on Indigenous partnership, sovereignty, and strategic infrastructure. In July, Parliament passed Bill C-5 to fast-track development in Inuit regions. What makes this unique isn't just the scale of the investment, it's who's leading it. Canada has appointed an Arctic ambassador from the Inuit community. It has opened new consulates in Anchorage and Greenland and pledged over $6 billion Canadian for radar systems, transport corridors, and northern energy projects. These initiatives are being developed with direct leadership from Inuit organizations, building both trust and long-term capacity. But this isn't just a domestic agenda, it's a strategic signal to Washington. By investing heavily in the Arctic, Canada is positioning itself as the democratic anchor in a region where Russia is militarizing and China is actively expanding influence. At the same time, it's quietly challenging America's assumption of uncontested dominance in North American defense. And this goes far beyond geopolitics. The Arctic holds vast reserves of critical minerals, lithium, cobalt, rare earth elements, the raw materials essential for electric vehicles, advanced electronics, and modern weapon systems. According to the US Geological Survey, as of 2024, the United States still sourced over 90% of its rare earth imports from China. Canada's new approach, working directly with Inuit communities under constitutionally protected agreements, means control over these resources won't be dictated by external pressure. Any future US access to Arctic supply chains will require trust, cooperation, and respect for indigenous governance. If Trump believed tariffs were the only leverage, he may have miscalculated. While the White House focuses on short-term wins, Canada is securing long-term power, in territory, in resources, and in its relationships. And if Washington doesn't recalibrate, it risks being locked out of both Arctic diplomacy and the mineral supply chains it desperately needs. Trump may have assumed Canada had no other options, that it would wait in line for a new deal. But Canada is writing its own script. While some countries are chasing US approval, Canada is building internal strength, defending its industries, rebalancing trade, and forming deep alliances with its own people. Dava that Brazil will respond in kind with its own tariffs if the US goes through what it wants to do by August 1st. Your thoughts? President Donald Trump's second-term trade doctrine has entered a volatile phase. In recent weeks, the administration has issued formal notices to a string of trade partners: 35% tariffs on Canada, 30% on Mexico, 50% on Brazil. These aren't just economic decisions. They are calculated power plays, and the world is responding. Rather than strengthening American leverage, Trump's tariff blitz is hardening resistance. Countries that once depended on US trade are now coordinating responses, and, in some cases, turning away altogether. We both agree that it is essential to respect the USMCA trade agreements, and we shared our experiences about the letter we received from President Trump. One of the clearest signs that Trump's pressure is backfiring came this week, when Canada and Mexico publicly pledged to strengthen bilateral trade. Both countries confirmed they had received tariff letters from the US, 35% for Canada, 30% for Mexico, set to take effect August 1st if negotiations fail. In response, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney and Mexican President Claudia Sheinbaum agreed to deepen economic cooperation. Carney is expected to visit Mexico in the coming weeks to formalize joint strategies for two neighbors long tied to the US through the USMCA. This pivot marks a significant realignment. Rather than fracture, Trump's tariff threats are pushing America's closest allies to close ranks, without the US. Consider that maybe for the last 50 years, we are going through the worst moment here in the relation between Brazil and Washington. Tensions are even sharper further south. Brazil was hit with the steepest tariff, 50% on all exports to the US, up from 10% announced in April. Trump framed the move as retaliation for what he called political persecution of former Brazilian President Jair Bolsonaro, who faces charges for his role in the January 2023 coup attempt. Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva rejected the move as an act of political interference. His administration immediately activated a new fast response tariff mechanism, authorizing counter-tariffs against US goods. According to Brazil's Ministry of Development, only 12% of Brazilian exports are destined for the US, allowing the country to redirect trade with minimal disruption. The sectors affected include oil, orange juice, coffee, and steel. While the economic exposure is manageable, the diplomatic damage is real. Lula has publicly signaled a shift toward deeper ties with BRICS nations and Asian partners, a trend accelerated by Trump's moves. This is unilateralism, and it's highly personalistic. It's President Trump, because he doesn't like somebody, and I think it has very severe implications for US relations with Latin America. The ripple effects go beyond Brazil. In Colombia, relations have deteriorated rapidly after allegations emerged linking US figures to an attempted political plot. Trump responded by recalling the US ambassador and threatening to revoke Colombia's drug cooperation certification, a move that could cut vital aid. But instead of backing down, President Gustavo Petro has pushed back. His administration is now exploring deeper ties with BRICS institutions, including development financing outside the US orbit. Across Latin America, a quiet realignment is underway. Countries are looking to diversify trade, reduce political exposure, and limit dependency on Washington. Trump's aggressive stance may be aimed at asserting dominance, but the region's reaction suggests it's having the opposite effect. I mean, is it a political failure for the Prime Minister if Canada ends up at some level of tariffs at the end of this? Or is it just the reality of dealing with Donald Trump? What began as a strategy to strengthen US leverage is now showing signs of unraveling. Rather than forcing deals on America's terms, the tariff campaign is driving partners together and away from Washington's orbit. Canada is no longer negotiating alone. Mexico is no longer avoiding alignment. Brazil, once neutral, is openly confronting US influence. And in Europe, even close allies are preparing for long-term trade diversification. For the Trump administration, the short-term political optics may still resonate with parts of the domestic base, but the long-term cost is rising. Fractured trust, declining diplomatic capital, and global supply chains that are learning to work around, not through, the United States. The real impact of these tariffs may not be in what they tax. It may be in what they break. This is the True State Report. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next video.